We all know that the Chalamed, everybody is off work, says, we made Chalamed need to live Mונטריאול, and therefore we have a new Torah. We started yesterday and continue today, and tomorrow will be a continuation from today. We have the honor today to have Choshev Yoman, Shliach from Reverend Mונטריאול, New York, a good friend, Harav Achosi, Harav ציון Khanovish, is going to be the son. We will take a Kingston.
Shmulik, for Shlema. So the Rebbe the Sikha just spoke about the Natilas Lulav, that the brachas about Torah, and afterwards it goes to Masach Doshim Yitzarecha. So usually by Kiddush Torah, it's usually more pilpul in Halacha, in Linyan and Nigla, Chassidus. But today I'd like to take something starting with the Lulav of Torah, to bring it down practical. So one of the things I'm involved in is in kashrus. There's a pasuk in Chumash Shmini. Rashi said the Shmini and Rashi there. It says lahavdil ben atami ben atoy, ben achai and achelas ben achai shaloi seyachol. That's important to separate between tummy and toy. So Rashi asks, "Tzarchleim ben chamoy ben Torah, loifam for Shmein." And Rashi says the difference is. During the Shechita, so you have to shech the fun and the Reishit. The halacha is that if you shech less than half, it's not considered Shechita. If you shech more than half, it's considered Shechita. How much is the difference? It's a very fine difference. Actually, I should say B'shaychit, practically, I don't know B'shaychit that would allow a little bit more than Chetzer Shulchan. Most Shulchan or trade has to be, very by middle high. But regardless, Rashi says that that's a type of lahavdil. Today's world, most of us don't go to shlachtos, most of us don't do melicha, most of us know that chickens come in packages in the stores, and they come with only bottoms or only tops, and it's not. So what does lahavdil mean to us? So I would recommend, I would say, offer that possibly to know what goes on during hashgacha. The people who are mashgichim are shliach tzibur, we're here to represent the tzibur, and you as a tzibur need to know what's going on in the places of kashrus, and that's the lahavdil that we have. In a few minutes, I'm just going to start off with some general sort of introductions to some issues in kashrus. There's a lot that goes on in kashrus. I should say I do mainly commercial kashrus, not retail kashrus. Retail kashrus is in a store, in a catering place, in a restaurant. That's retail kashrus. Commercial kashrus means you go to factories. Factories have their own, it's a different type of kashrus. So it says in, I think it's in Simon Sadi Beis, I'm sorry, I came a little late today, so I wanted to double check. What happens if someone has a pot, a fleshik pot, and a drop of milk falls in the pot on the outside? And it depends if there is liquid on the inside at the time or not, and so on in halacha. That's a very relevant piece of halacha in today's commercial kashrus. Why is that so? Because in most commercial places they do not have fire in the plant, the processing plant itself. So how do the pots get heated? The two ways that pots can get heated. There's either a steam pipe or a hot water pipe. So we all know behind us there are radiators. How does the radiators get heated? There's a boiler somewhere. The boiler heats up hot water, and then it sends the water around through those pipes, and then they're fins, and that's the way it gets heated. Similarly, in a plant, they don't want fire on the plant floor, so they heat up a tank, a huge tank, and it sends around the water to all of the different tanks. Again, how does it heat a tank? It's not small pots, these are huge pots. So what they have is a double boiler, sort of a double boiler, a pot within a pot, and then in between is a space. So the hot water goes to that space, or the steam, we'll get into steam in a little bit, goes into that space, and it's between the outside pot and the inside pot, and that's what heats up the pot itself. Problem is that sometimes the problem is you want to get it even hotter. How do you get it hotter? That's one of the reasons why they use steam, because steam gets over 212 degrees. There is another possibility, which is a closed circuit that's under pressure, a pressurized circuit, is able to bring the heat above 212. I don't want to go into all the details, just general. Now, what happens, so usually when you go to a large plant, there are two types of large plants. There's a plant that's only dedicated to kosher, which means they may make a certain product, it's always going to be kosher, and you only have to spot check. I want to get into that if I can, just to touch on spot checking too. The other one is if the plant makes kosher and non-kosher. So when it makes kosher, you have to kosherize the plant. How do you kosherize it? So you all know, if you have a pot that needs to be kosherized, you have to wait 24 hours to make sure it's Ein Ben Yoima. You have to make sure it's clean, and I should say, it's not that easy to make sure it's clean, because one particular plant that comes to mind, the pots there are 10,000 gallons, 3 floors up. You have to go up 3 floors up. How do you check the inside of a pot that's 3 floors down? So we have a high beam, and you have to go through it. They have what they call CIP, cleaning it, in process cleaning it while it's they have a system to clean it for health reasons. It's usually pretty good, but not 100% good. So you have to find the tricky areas where possibly there's some things left over before you kosher. Okay, once that's done, very simple. You fill it up to the top. You also have to worry about the cover of the container. You also have to make sure that that the water boils over. Simple. No, not so simple. Because what about the water that heats this pot? The water that heats a pot, since we say tipas chalav shenafal b'chutz, it transfers kashrus outside the pot. That water became not kosher. Now that water, even though you kasher the inner pot, what about the water in between? So you have to make sure you drain that water. Now I'm simplifying it. It's not so simple because if you have a hot water system, you always want the water to move. There's always going to be new water that comes in, because once the hot water you send in to heat up the pot, after a while it cools down. You want it to remain hot. So it's a closed system which keeps on going around. It's a loop which keeps on going around. So the water that was in the pot continues going to the loop, goes back to the big boiler. Now what do you do with the boiler? The boiler is full of non-kosher water. So how do you do that? So you could either empty out the boiler and kosher it, or there's something called, if you learn in Shulchan Aruch, I believe, it's either Kuf Gimel or Kuf Dalet, in Taruvas, it speaks about some things which are apostle me'achilas kelev, some things which are human beings don't eat, and some things which even an animal won't eat. Something which is apostle me'achilas kelev, so then it has no ability to bring Isra. Let me just clarify. So let's say you have something not kosher, and it was cooked in water. The water carries the Isra, and the water carries the Isra into the pot and makes it also. Now, what happens if you cook in something which is pasal mechilas kelev? It does not have the ability to carry the Isra into the pot, even though it's the same treif that came into that pasal mechilas kelev liquid. It will still not make the pot kosher. So one of the things that some plants do is they introduce something into the boiler to make sure the water is going to be pasal me'achilas kelev, and therefore, even though that water went around and became theoretically would have become treif from the pot which you cooked treif in it, it does not carry the treif because it's pasal me'achilas kelev. I should just caution the two types of pasal me'achilas kelev as nafkamina l'alacha. So what do? So there's something called pH level, which is a balance of I don't know what it is, alkaline and so there's a pH level, which is a certain balance of water has, I think, a 7 pH level. Usually, if you bring it up to 11.5, it'll become pasal me'achilas kelev. Often, I go to a plant and I ask them to open up I measure it to see if it's pasal me'achilas it follows 11.5, I still taste some and spit it out. Taste some from the boiler. I shouldn't tell my wife, she might be happy. But that's one way. Another way of doing it is introducing something called Bitrex. Bitrex is a very potent liquid, which a drop of it will make a whole boiler be impossible will taste bitter. Actually, one time, the first time I was using Bitrex, I used gloves, and I was introducing 2-3 ounces into a huge vat for milk or cheese, and I got a drop on my finger, and somehow I must have touched my lip, because for a week I could not taste any food. It's very, very powerful. And what it does is, it makes a puzzle mechanism. So I want to, I want to bring up one thing which I think is very interesting. So people usually have I don't want to go into the topic, I just want to touch on this. There's some people that discuss what's the difference between this Hashem, that Hashem, Hamish Hashem, and everything. I'm not going into it. But I want to bring out something which is opposite than what people think. There is a concept in Halacha called Kiboyle Kachboyle. The same way that something has an ability to absorb taste, the same way you can expel, you can give out and take away the taste. So what does that mean? So there's a question, which means simply, in Halacha it says, that is something that what became also by direct contact with the non-kosher food, like for example, like if you broil something, then you consider the only way to kasher is by libun gamar. If it became also through liquid indirect, then you can kasher through hagala. So there are some that take the same concept in terms of the temperature of the water. What happens? We know that something absorbs once it's over 120 degrees, 140 degrees, it absorbs. Now, what happens if it absorbs, let's say, cheese process, which you know is not going to go above 160 to 140 degrees because the cheese will burn. Can you kosher it at 140 degrees, or do you need to have 212? So the Minchas Yitzchak, which is one of the source of a lot of the Siddush Hashkafas, says the same way it absorbs, the same way it can expel. The Moshe the Sefer writes Chas v'Shalom to rely on that, because it doesn't say in halacha, it doesn't say Kiboyle Kachpoltoi in temperature, it says Kiboyle Kachpoltoi in ways of absorbing and expelling, but not in temperature, and therefore the halacha is that anything that needs hagala has to be brought up to 212. Practically speaking, almost all of Shaylim use it to some degree. Use the head of the Minchas Yitzchak to some degree. The question is, do they use it with b'd'chol or do they use it with the yad? So a good hafsha, what I would consider a good hafsha, would say, look, bring it up to 212. If you can't, you can rely on the Kiboyle Kachpoltoi, possibly you can rely on the Kiboyle Kachpoltoi. But there's some Hashadim that are not as careful, and they're not so, they say Kiboyle Kachpoltoi, that's the way they do it. One more point, I just don't have my time limit. Someone asked me before I spoke today, so how do you know what goes on? If you visit the plant from time to time, how do you know what goes on in between your visits? That's a very serious question. Actually, I have a shuvah for Rabbi Weissman about it, or more shuvah. But I want to just bring out one point. There's a big difference between going to a big plant and going to a small factory. If you go to a big plant, so one of the plants I'm going to be going to, they work with soybeans, a certain type of soybean, and they order it a year in advance. There's a contract a year in advance. What happens if they're missing it? What happens if something goes wrong? Actually, it's a real story that happened. ADM, which is one of the biggest suppliers, recently, about a year ago, had a fire in their warehouse, and it burned down tons and tons of soybean. The company had to make a product which they needed that soybean, and for half a year they were delayed because they could not get the soybean from anywhere else. Why? They could go to somewhere else and get it, but they want to test it to make sure it's 100%, and to go through all the shiva nekim of testing, of their testing takes a long time. It takes a year to process it. But if you're going to go to a Hamish store and he's in the middle of making and he runs out of one ingredient, but go down to the next store, to the grocery store, and buy some. You don't have that level of control. In addition, when I go to a huge plant, I go through the computer records, I see what they have, everything is documented. No such thing as them using an ingredient which does not have, which you don't know the lot number, you don't know the date. What happens if someone got sick, they have to go through to figure out. And if the government catches them not documenting any of them, they're finished. No big company would do something like that. So to give hashgacha on a big company, that's relatively easy. To give hashgacha on someone on the corner that's making something is much, much harder. I'm going to just end off something from Rabbi Heinemann. Rabbi Heinemann once said as follows. To give, you could argue with him if you like, but I happen to be very close to Rabbi Heinemann on certain issues. He says, to give hashgacha to a goy, it's doable. To give hashgacha to a yid, not from, is harder, but it's also doable. To give hashgacha to a firm person, that's the hardest. And he told over the following story that they had given hashgacha to a pizza shop in Borough Park, and there was a problem in the pizza shop, and the mashgiach calls him up, and he says, and he left a message. Apparently he wasn't available, and he left a message. So as soon as he was able to return to school, the mashgiach says, Rabbi Heinemann, don't worry, everything's taken care of. He says, what do you mean? He says, I called it up big. The big is a chashuv of in Borough Park. I don't know if it's this one, it was the one earlier. I called it up big, and he told me what to do. Rabbi Heinemann said, no, that's a mistake. Chas v'shalom. He says, why? He said, I want to tell you, for my personal life, if I had a shayla, I'd be very comfortable asking him big, and whatever he tells me to do, I would do. But not on kashrus. Kashrus in the store is very different than kashrus in your house. And that's one of the difficulties of giving kashrus in the local place. I hope it clarifies it.
Shkoyach. First of all, we need Gabon to send somebody to the Omer. The Hemshach of the Kийнus will take him to Shem tomorrow. Shkoyach Rabbi ציון. Yarech Mama Mumlachte. Archove. Nachas von allem. Nu, Shmuli. Der Elon wartet vor dir.